Hey everyone, my name is ashtongleckman and welcome back to Behind the Score. In today's episode, we're going to be diving into Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard's score for The Dark Knight. I recently got to attend a 10th anniversary screening of The Dark Knight shown on IMAX film, and it really just enforced my love and appreciation for this movie. And the score is fascinating because there's so many different layers to it. It's intense, it's emotional, it's gritty and provocative. It's really this amazing musical subtext that just sort of falls into the world that Christopher Nolan created. So we're going to be diving into all these musical elements and taking a look at the themes, the sonic world that they created, how it works within the narrative. I've arranged a suite as usual that includes the logos, the bank robbery sequence. We have the buyer beware, LSI extraction, which is sort of like the hero theme, a trip to Hong Kong, the new DA, find the Batman, the fairies, truck convoy, which is sort of a reprise of the Joker theme, I'm Not a Hero, which is the finale, and The Dark Knight, which is the final cue of the whole entire movie. But without further ado, thanks so much for joining me, and here is the suite. Dark Knight is the second film in Christopher Nolan's trilogy, and a follow-up to the 2005 film Batman Begins. In the film, Batman, Police Lieutenant Gordon, and the District Attorney Harvey Dent must form an alliance to bring justice to the crime in Gotham City. But after a mastermind anarchist known as the Joker emerges, wreaking havoc on Gotham, the Dark Knight is forced to accept one of the greatest psychological and physical challenges to fight injustice. Scoring began long before filming was commenced, with one of the first pieces being the Joker Suite, a 9-minute piece consisting of guitars, electric cello, solo violin, and a string section. The piece also featured highly experimental sounds such as razor blades on stringed instruments, sounds taken from over 10 hours of initial experiments. Throughout scoring, Hans focused heavily on Batman and the Joker, while James focused on Harvey Dent and Two-Face. This collaboration created a perfect contrast in the score. The score also featured the brilliant work by sound designers Mel Wesson and Howard Scarr, who helped to develop lots of the gritty musical soundscapes used throughout the film. The Dark Knight explores various musical sound worlds, with the Joker's content living mainly within a rock-punk style, Batman's material being a gritty evolution from Batman Begins, and Harvey Dent's material being new and fresh, feeling bright and warm. The score went on to win at the Grammys for Best Original Soundtrack for Visual Media, and at the Classical Brit Awards for Best Soundtrack. So The Dark Knight is a big score to unpack. It's around 2 hours and 30 minutes of music, which is a pretty large amount. And that would include Hans's music, James's music, as well as Mel Wesson's ambient music design. And that all makes up around 90% of the film. And some of the sections in the movie are very, very sort of soft and more minimal, such as the sort of Bruce Wayne, Rachel content, some of the Harvey Dent material. Some are very, very big, but nonetheless, 2 hours and 30 minutes is a pretty large amount of music. And I'll put up a cue sheet here so you can sort of see how all that's laid out. So let's discuss some of these scoring devices used in The Dark Knight by Hans and James. And the first one would be the heavy use of ostinatos. Now what ostinatos are essentially repeated figures which create sort of movement and action. And the thing about ostinatos is that they don't only function rhythmically, but they also function tonally. So many times Hans will be outlining chords. He'll also have sort of like phrases with sort of bass lines moving under it. He'll put chords above certain ostinatos. And he'll also sort of create very sort of complex textures with ostinatos. And so it's very, very commonly used in this movie and constantly creates this sense of, momentum. I think it works perfectly for the Nolan world that, he sort of created for Batman. And it works great to sort of keep that momentum moving. The second one would be the use of sort of like a rock punk attitude with the Joker content. The prologue of the film is a perfect introduction to the character because you're seeing not only, him as a character and how he sort of works and his sort of mind, but you're also seeing his musical identity, which is then evolved and used all throughout the film in sort of fragments and built up to a huge crescendo during the third act. But you hear all these different sort of motifs, you hear the use of the electric cello, you hear razor blades on strings, you hear sort of like rock, punk guitar riffs. I mean, all these different things which are so sort of fun and provocative and gritty. I think it perfectly describes the Joker. And this is a certain texture or a certain musicality that Hans really did have to invent for this film. And I think that it perfectly sort of came out and it perfectly translated.
He gave me this extraordinary sort of 9,000 bar long recordings of really complete insanity, and I dutifully listened to it all on the plane when we were flying from London to Hong Kong to go finish the shoot in Hong Kong. It took me most of the flight to listen to all of these different crazy experiments he'd done with razor blades on piano wire and pencils tapping tables and floors and things.
Just different fragments and different ideas, and there are literally thousands of them.
Next, we have the use of synthesizers and electronics. And this would include Hans's modular equipment, it would include Howard Scarr's custom patches and Zebra, it would include Mel Wesson's ambient music design with things like the bat flaps and Metasynth. And after the score was released, when they did Inception, they even upped the electronics even more so. But at the time of The Dark Knight, they'd upped it from Batman Begins, and it functioned in a much more prominent way. And the interesting thing about, The Dark Knight is that before The Dark Knight was released, there was a whole lot of scores that blended orchestral and synthesizer elements. But usually there was sort of a line that was drawn where you'd be able to tell what was orchestral and sort of what was synthetic and electronic. But with The Dark Knight, what Hans ended up doing is blending a lot of synthesizer elements into the orchestral stems. He would double things. He would very, very commonly blend it in to create this one big sonic world where sometimes you wouldn't be able to tell what was what. So very, very commonly we'll have things such as, electronics blending with orchestral stems, also electronics blending with percussion to really, really give it a little bit more grit and power. So there's a whole lot of blending happening, but there's also very particular moments where Hans will sort of bring the electronics above everything else and really let those shine. A good example of this would be in the opening prologue, where you'll very, very commonly hear all these sort of big pulses and rhythms. The next thing is something that Hans uses very frequently to create a lot of his sonic textures in this film, and that is layering rhythmic elements with accents and then a bed. So essentially the rhythm would create the momentum, that would be pulses, ostinatos, etc. Then you'd have sort of booms, which would, they could function as like a swell impacting a certain moment on film, like with the Joker Triumph motif, which we'll go over soon. Or you'll have something like a boom that leads from one scene to another. And then the third and final thing would be the bed. So that would be the harmony, big brass chords, something like that. And then all three of those elements, the rhythm, the accent, and then the underbed, would combine together to create that overall texture. The next thing is the use of distance and perspective in the actual recording process. So since they're recording everything separately, strings long separate from strings short, etc., they're able to experiment with a lot of really interesting mic positions and placements. For example, in this score, they put the French horns a certain amount of players up to the left, a certain amount of players up to the right, and then when the sound would meet in the middle, it created this very distinctive feel that this score has with the French horns. The strings short, Hans likes very upfront, small sections, so he would do that. And then the collegnos were even more closely mic'd for this film during all the Joker stuff. In addition, he likes the strings long, very royal, and to feel the warmth of the hall, which is why he loves Air Studios. And I think that this really shows that the volume isn't the only thing that's going to really determine how a viewer is going to feel the presence of a certain element. It can really depend on how far up it is, how far away it is in terms of distance, in terms of the sort of perspective around you, and they're constantly utilizing all these very interesting things, but particularly with the help of Jeff Foster, who's the great mixing engineer there. The great recording engineer, who really has all these cool ideas on where to place things. The next thing would be string configurations. Now, James had around 20 cues in this movie. I think Hans had around 26 or 27 cues in the film, and the string configurations were fairly similar, yet Hans's cues, I presume, had a lot more overdubs because there was a lot more ostinatos, a lot more sort of crazy string work happening. But they both did record in a very similar config, which would be 12, 12, 14, 14, and 8. Which mean 12 first violins, 12 second violins, 14 violas, 14 celli, and 8 basses, which essentially just mean that the lower section of the orchestra is a bit more powerful. But there's just a bit about the elements of the score, overdubs, and the string configuration. Now let's discuss some of the collaborations and timeline on this project. And probably one of the most prominent collaborations is Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard. A project like Hidden Figures, which I think is a perfect example of why this project went so well. You have Benjamin Wallfish, Pharrell Williams, and then Hans. They all bring their own thing into the project. Hans brought his sort of punk rock attitude into this project and created a score that perfectly fits the vibe of Batman and the Joker. James Newton Howard brought his very elegant musical background and really hit the nail on the head with the Harvey Dent and Two-Face material, and in Batman Begins, the Rachel Dawes and Bruce Wayne relationship. They both really just brought their own experiences into the project, and I think did a great job in forming a great collaboration. Now, up to the point of Batman Begins, Hans and James hadn't worked together before, and Mel Weston was the common denominator. He'd worked with both of them. He started working for Hans in the early 2000s for Ridley Scott's Hannibal, and he's the ambient music designer, so he essentially creates a lot of the interesting textures and some sounds for Hans, and he's a very sort of vital role in this particular series because he helps to create a lot of these gritty, cool textures that we come away with, including the famous bat flap. Now, in terms of orchestrators, both of the different composers worked with different orchestrators. Hans worked with Bruce Fowler and Walt Fowler, and James worked most commonly with Brad Dester and Randy Kerber. Alex Gibson is the supervising music editor on this film. Then we have Gavin Greenaway conducting the recording sessions. Gavin's worked with Hans for who knows how long. They've worked on tons of scores together. He conducted all of the World of Hans Zimmer tour. Now, apparently Hans, Mel, Martin Tillman doing the cello were the first people on the project because they were helping to formulate a lot of the Joker sounds. So, all the cello scrapes, stuff like that. There were like 10 hours of experiments that Christopher Nolan listened to that ended up being the Joker suite at the beginning of the movie. Now, Mel Weston describes something very particular about James's sort of timeline, is that James came on as production began, and then James left before the dub, but that's sort of how the timeline of the collaboration sort of worked.
You know, and there's like a question in that. As soon as you change one note underneath, right? Oh, suddenly we got hope in there.
Themes are, without a doubt, one of the most powerful scoring devices used by composers in film to help tell a narrative, because it helps the viewer sort of connect to certain elements in the story that can then get developed and evolve just as characters evolve or the story evolves. So it's a great way to sort of glue your audience into the world of the film. The first one is the one-note electric cello theme performed by Martin Tillman for the Joker. And the cool thing about this is it's like taking a guitar and just pulling at the strings and just waiting for it to snap. It's the surprising quality, the unpredictability, the tension, and it captures that, and it's perfect for the character. And it's used during the first few frames of the film, and it's used all the way up until the third act of the film when we see the Joker for the last time.
And I thought my jokes were bad.
Now we have the Batman theme, which is in two separate categories. The first one being the two-note theme, which is D and F, and then we have the ostinato pattern, which is a D minor second inversion chord. The next one is the Harvey Dent theme by James Newton Howard, which is split up into two 4-bar sort of passages. And I think it works really well to describe Harvey Dent's sort of honor. And as Harvey Dent goes into madness when you get into the Two-Face section of the movie during the third act, it sort of begins to get twisted. But it is a really, really strong theme that helps encapsulate his character and sort of what he's trying to do as the DA of Gotham City.
More than enough time to put you away for life, Sally. With Carmine Falcone and Arkham, someone must have stepped up to run the so-called family.
The next one is the Joker Triumph theme, and it's played whenever the Joker is, succeeding at something. And it's split up into two 16th notes, and it's sort of like a metal guitar type thing. It's used during the prologue quite a bit. The last one is the Stranger motif, and it starts on a D and it sort of ports down to like a C. We see it when we first see the Joker in the movie, and I think it works really well during the very dark periods of the film to help describe something is off. In terms of the secondary themes, the first one is the Bruce and Rachel theme, and it's much different because Bruce and Rachel as characters are in a completely different place. Rachel is with Harvey Dent, Bruce feels a little bit separated, and it's like this big triangle, and this is describing the sort of tension within that, within these relationships. The next one's the Anarchy motif, and it's pretty much just C and D played at the same time. And essentially what this is meant to do is just say like something is off, something is going on, and just create a sense of, absolute chaos. Next we have the Morning theme, which is used 4 different times in the movie, I believe. It's used the first time when Gordon is shot, again when they have to go back to his house and tell his wife. It's used again when Bruce Wayne is in his penthouse after he's sort of just witnessed the death of Rachel, and he's in this very sort of bad place. And then it's used again in I'm Not a Hero, which is the second to last cue. Now we have the reference themes, and we have 2 for Bruce and Rachel from Batman Begins. The first one has this sort of suspension feel to it. It's very sort of subtle. And then the second one is sort of like this very Dorian feeling sequence, which is like D minor, B flat major, and then G major. The next one is the Youth and Innocence theme, and it's played with an oboe, and it's used in Batman Begins whenever we see Bruce as a child. And it's used in this film when Gordon goes back to his home and he sees his child. So I would presume it's used whenever there's this feeling of childhood or youth. But there are all of the themes in The Dark Knight. So welcome to the sweet breakdown portion of the video, and we're going to get started with the opening cue of the film 1M1, which is the logos. And the first sound that we hear before we even see a frame of footage is the bat flap sound designed by Mel Weston. And I think the awesome thing about this is that it really tells us what we're getting ourselves into, what the film is going to feel like. So I think it's really cool to have the music act as like this precursor to the story and just really send your audience into the film. So let's just go ahead and listen to the first half of this opening cue here. So let's just take a look at the various layers of this specific sound. So, I've gone into the Hans Zimmer Zebra, which is Hans' sort of own personal version of Zebra. and I've gone into a sound bank called The Dark Zebra, designed by Howard Scarr, and these are actually a lot of the original sounds from The Dark Knight, which is pretty cool. And I've gotten this sound called Bat Flaps Performer, and I've sort of edited the multi-stage EG, which is how you shape the sound. I've gone in, sort of edited the cutoff to be a bit more intense, and we have this. It sort of forms this pulse. And that is being doubled with this sound, which is a bit just more low. And those are both sort of working with this sub rumble. That is, again, this sort of pulse just sitting below everything. And then we have this other one, which is sort of a bit more of a pulsating effect. This specific sound is sort of like just raw noise with a cutoff. I call it the bat flap kick. And so we have those elements, and then we have a couple other elements just sort of creating a little bit more movement. And actually just one other element, which would essentially just be the bat flap hi-hats. And essentially all that we have on this specific sound is a stereo delay, creating a bit of movement. You can see I programmed one to be a half and one to be a quarter. So it's constantly going back and forth. And then in addition to that, I've thrown on a auto pan just to really make the stereo image a bit crazy. So that's all that we have going on for that specific sound. And then going into bar 4, we go into a few sort of like pad-like sounds. So here's what that sounds like. So again, like a pad texture like this is sort of made up of a few different layers. We have this sort of, this is a bit more sort of high-end bright. This specific sound, a bit more low and airy. Very much like a sub bass. Essentially, it's a sub bass. Much more of a sound design, right? So we have the bright, the airy, the sub bass, and together that gives us that texture. And then this is when we bring in our collegnos, and the collegnos is actually a pretty big part of the sort of Joker's textural content. So we really figure out what the Joker sounds like in this film during the first 10 minutes, because the prologue really is our push into the story, and most certainly, probably one of the grandest character introductions of all time when we first see the Joker. So let's just listen to this, and then we'll check out what's happening. Alrighty, so first of all, for the strings short, we just have a couple different collegno patches doubling each other. You can see this first one that we have is from Hans Zimmer strings. And then I have another patch from Spitfire Mural, just sort of doubling that to give it a bit more air and a bit more room. Alrighty, so now we sort of get into the action, and you'll hear that we have this collegno, 16th notes. And then, of course, one of the most important elements in the whole entire movie, which is what I call the Joker cello. And what I've done is I've taken, let me just go ahead and unfreeze this. I've taken a patch from the 8-Dio solo electric cello, and I've essentially just taken the harmonics, and I've put on a guitar rig distortion, and so here's what it sounds like on its own. And then just added a bit of black hole to give it room, and then a bit of EQ just to sort of shape it, add a bit more bright frequencies to it. So we have a few new pulses that are introduced here. So this sort of Hans Zimmer, string pluck sound is doubling what we have going on in the strings. And as we were talking about in the, thematic gallery, this is the chaos or the anarchy motif. So here is this sound. So there's two different layers. What I've done is I've just split up, the notes D and C, just so we can sort of control them differently and automate the volumes differently so they can weave in and out of each other. And so if you listen to the actual score, you can hear sounds like this are just sort of going all over the stereo image. And this is Hans' way of making sounds that otherwise are relatively simple and static, this specific pulse, without any effects. It would still be interesting, but when we add all these effects on top of it and we have stereo pans and making them both independent of each other and having them automate in and out, it makes a sound that's otherwise very static sort of very interesting and sonically giving it a lot of movement. And so we go from a sound, like during this sequence, which is a very sort of intense, upfront, very intrusive synth sound, to a much more open, wide synth sound. And during this specific moment is when Joker's men are ziplining over the city, so it needed something that felt very tall, very big, very intense, and I think that this sort of combination of sounds, which is essentially this noise pulse, which has a very percussive feel to it, combined with this, sub bass, and then a bit more of an intense one, this sound called the aerial bass, which is again that very wide, has a lot of presence to it, and I've doubled that with a sound called bat punk. So all of that together. And the percussion is made up of a few different layers consisting of a sort of big taiko ensemble. It's mainly using like the big ambient mics, and then we have epic toms, much more bright, and then this bass drum gallery again from Hans Zimmer percussion. And then we sort of have the low impacts, which are Hans Zimmer percussion low booms. And so this specific string sound is doing the exact same thing it was doing prior, but we've taken the C and we've just sent it up an octave. And then we have these new sort of pulses that come in, which this is the Joker Triumph. You can see how it has that very sort of metal punk rock sound to it. I mean, as Hans has said, it essentially is punk rock music played by, heavy hitting synthesizers. So let's just take a look at what we have going on here. So we have a distorted pulse, which is from Project Bravo, which is great for those low gritty sounds. Then we have a low arpeggio. Again, a lot more bright. Cutoff is pretty much all the way up. Not meant to create a wide sound, but meant to create a much more sort of intense driving sound. Combining that with some filter sweeps. And then we get into the lower section. And then this awesome patch called Demented Guitar from Omnisphere. And then, as a sort of final touch, I've taken a guitar from Metropolis Arc 1, and I'm just sort of, which doubles perfectly, by the way, with the distorted pulse from Project Bravo. So the percussion here is essentially just made up of hi-hats, sticks, some low drums for impact, and some metal sheets, which are 16th notes. So you can see the metal sheets are really just providing a great edge to what we have going on in the distorted pulse and the guitar. So let's just grab the guitar heads. Here's what those sound like together. Perfect. And then going into this next section, we have this big sort of atonal build, which is a classic Joker texture in this movie. And it's made up of a few different layers. We have the Joker cello, which is, here, let's just find that. Here it is. Here's what that sounds like on its own. It's being doubled with a sort of textural string patch from, this is just Olafur Arnold's Chamber Evolutions, actually. But I've set it to the sort of unpredictability sort of setting, so it's constantly moving in all of these very peculiar directions. And that's being doubled with the ghost bend sound, again, programmed by Howard Scarr. It's such a cool sound effect. And it just builds and builds and builds and builds till finally we get the stranger motif. Alright, this specific texture is relatively simple. All that we have going on is brass cluster hits. And then the percussion is really what's giving this its sort of gritty impact. And this specific texture is used quite a bit, not only in The Dark Knight, but very commonly in Dark Knight Rises, especially during that third act during the big battle. So essentially the toms are doing most of the work and really providing the movement. We have the taikos really providing the hits. Those are being doubled by the bass drums just for a bit of a rounder. Paper Juns are really good if you want like a very focused sound. So I'm using that constantly doubling with the epic toms just to give it a bit more of a focused tone, because the epic toms are very wide and sort of big. And those are all being doubled by the metals just for all of these downbeats. Which again just gives it a bit more of a intrusive sound, which I think works perfectly for this texture. One thing about Hans's writing in general, you know, with whether it's his string shorts or whether it's percussion, it's the contrast between the big ambient wide stuff and the very upfront focused stuff that actually creates what you perceive to be that wide sound. If I were to get rid of all of the very focused, very close mic sounds in this specific suite, it would automatically start sounding a bit flat. But since he has different things in different sort of perspectives, like we were talking about with the miking, he'll have things up in the gallery, he'll have things very up front, and he'll combine them all together. It creates that very wide sound that we all perceive. So that's just a little sort of ramble on that. But let's just go into what we have in the piano section. Alrighty, so first layer is from Metropolis Arc 3. Then we have this sound. Bit more of a gross sound. If you listen to this specific cue, the buyer, beware cue when all of the fake Batmans at the beginning of the movie come out and try to attack Scarecrow. It's got this super, super dirty piano sound in it. I don't know what it is. It might be like them destroying a piano. I don't have the budget to destroy my piano over here, so I'm just using samples. But it's got a super cool gritty sound that works really well with those brass clusters and, with the resonance of the metal sheet to really give it that edge. that he's doing here that makes this texture so interesting is he's taking all of these very upfront, closely mic'd sounds and he's throwing them around the stereo spectrum like crazy. So let's just take a look at, you know, all the various layers. So you can see that we have 2 different layers of this for both ends, and the delay is set differently. So sometimes they're intersecting in the middle, sometimes they're ending up on different speakers. Oops, there's the collect now. Coming on the ands. Then we have the Hans Zimmer strings violins, which I've taken and I've just sort of upped the high end just so it sounds a lot more like plucky and airy. And in the percussion, we're doing the exact same thing. We're just throwing things around the stereo image. And the cool thing is, again, sometimes it ends up being in the middle, sometimes they end up being on their own speaker. But in general, like, the cool thing is that everything sounds independent yet still unified because they all are sort of programmed to be acting differently. So here, for example, we have and then to complement the stereo image stuff, there's a few elements just having a lot of delay that's just staying in the center to really equal everything out. And that would be these 2 elements here. And what I've done is I've just taken this large taiko sound, I've just essentially taken off all of the low end, which ends up making it sound like a very large tom or something. And you know, it creates a good pulse when combined with the rest of the percussion. So we really just have this like one gritty pulse lying underneath. We have this synth percussion sound, which is just giving it a bit of a... We've brought back these bat flap sound effects, or the hi-hats. And then this sound is just to transition, you know, into a beat. And so there is that texture between 36 and 39. So for this section between 38 and 46, let's just listen to the short strings on their own. So every patch is sort of achieving something different, whether it's like layering or, you know, harmonically speaking, like the violas are harmonizing with everything else. But for the layering, we have very upfront violin sound, which in terms of stereo image is out here. Then we have a very upfront cello sound, which is around here. So we're filling up our stereo image. Have some spiccatos, which are right around here. Harmony. And then last but not least, we have something just filling in dead center in the middle. And then the actual string melody is being played by a Spitfire consort strings patch from Spitfire chamber strings, combined with the Hans Zimmer cellos from Hans Zimmer strings. Percussion barely has anything going on other than some low booms, and then the brass is just warming up what we have going on in the strings. You know, French horn ensemble is doubling the string melody. So for the synths, we have this sound called knife cut. because it just sounds so incredibly like stabby and intrusive, but when you put it contextually, it's just perfect. This patch calls Open ARP. And these are really just part of the same sort of food group in terms of not necessarily warm synth pulses, but very sonically specific synth pulses that work within a texture. Sub bass. And then we're keeping these sort of motor transition sounds. Alright, so now let's move on to this next little section. So it's made up of some brass shorts. So one of them is, of course, the French horns, which are playing the main harmonies. And then the trombones are just, you know, continuing this momentum. And then the percussion. We have the metal sheets on all of the brass hits. And again, we have the epic toms, you know, keeping all of the movement and action. And then we have the lower drums really creating all of these big impacts. So for the strings, the basses are just doubling the trombones, and then we have the upper strings playing this ostinato figure. It's actually not an ostinato, it's more of like a phrase. So for a trip to Hong Kong, what we're doing is we're just taking the bat flaps. It's a bit more quicker. And we have this low sub bass just. And then we have a pad doubling that. So for the strings, we're just repeating this ostinato. And then on bar 56, I just bring in the Hans Zimmer strings just to give it a little bit more focus. And this is just another example of Hans' preferred configuration for short strings, which is essentially these small, tight, up front sort of string sections. And so, you know, especially like the cellos, very up front. A little bit more ambience here. And then a bit more focus. So every single layer sort of has its own impact on the sonic configuration. And then for the strings, we just have this low bass, doubled by the brass. And you can hear how just the low brass just warms the bass up a lot. And the percussion is pretty simple. Again, we have our sub bass element, synth drums, low drums, and then a more focused low taiko. So for the new DAQ, we essentially have an E major chord with a minor sixth. And this is an A minor with a major sixth in the bass. We have this cluster, back to that A minor. And then we go into this little section with the piano. And then below that we have a few synth patches, a sub bass. So this cue is consisted of a ostinato, and then we have the basses come in. And you remember when we were talking about ostinatos, there's so many things that you can do on top of an ostinato, like have high chords, or you can have like a low moving bass line like this. And this is just another way for which you can make an ostinato interesting by adding an element like this moving on top of it. And this is, of course, the low bass being doubled, again, by the low brass. And as we get a little bit further into the piece, right around bar 89, we introduce a little bit of harmony. Percussion, barely anything is going on other than a couple hits right here, bar 83 and 90. And here's what that sounds like. And that is pretty much all that we have going on in that specific cue. And this cue leads directly into the fairies, which takes place, of course, at the ending of the film when they're making the decision on whether they want to, activate the bomb of the other person's ship. And so it's a moment of like very high tension. You don't really know what's going to happen. And this specific piece is playing when one of the prisoners goes up to the guards and says, give it to me. It's this very tension-filled moment, and you don't really know what's going to happen. And the harmony for this scene is D minor, so D minor first inversion, so with a third in the bass, B flat major, and then G minor. Melody starts out lower, strings. So when the melody's playing in the lower section, it's much more brassy, and then when it goes into, we get a little bit more string work happening. So it's going between two different sort of sonic textures. And the string shorts are just the Batman ostinato with a D5 sitting above it. Percussion, he's doing something he does quite a bit where he'll have these swells that lead into these, huge hits. So it's made up of 2 layers. Plus the timpanis. Contextually. So for the brass, what we've done is we have a sort of less aggressive, more natural horn for the first figure, and then for the second figure we bring in a more hard-hitting, aggressive horn. And then the low brass is an octave sitting below everything else, just warming again the whole entire texture up. So for Truck Convoy, we have the Joker cello come in, and then another one come in, like a microtone higher, slowly but surely pitch bending, while also modding up, so the timbre is changing while also the pitch. And then we have some textural strings, adding a bit of body. Again, still really, really unpredictable, lots of tension. And then, of course, some atmospheric wind. And then we bring in the ghost bend. We have a hit here that's built from tremolo, low brass, bend, and just a bit of sort of wind that pushes us into this last cue. So it's more used as like a transitional element. So now we get into the morning theme, C sus4 to C minor, D sus4, and we're skipping to the section that leads into the sort of main section. G major with a third in the bass, C minor, and then the bass moves down. And then that, of course, leads you to D minor. One of the things that I love about the way that Hans ends his films is that he brings everything into one central musical concept, whether it's time from Inception, where we're going from Interstellar, Chevaliers de Cingril from, I don't know if I pronounced that right, from Da Vinci Code, or you have Now We Are Free from Gladiator. He brings everything to one idea, and he just lets it build and build and build until it reaches one crescendo, and then finally the movie ends, and you're left with a black screen and a whole lot to think about. So it's another example of a cue where it's relatively simple harmony, but he's making it come to life with the expressiveness, you know, the sonic landscape that he's creating, and of course the way for which it builds, not only in terms of, you know, volume and expressiveness, but also instrumentation. And so now we are on to the final minute of the film, and I don't think there could possibly have been a better cue picked for this moment, because you have the Batman ostinato in full force, you have the drums just really going at it, you have the brass, you know, with the full expressiveness leading up to that big B-flat major chord. It's just so expressive, so intense, and I think it's a perfect way to say farewell to the audience. So it's just a really great cue. Let's just go ahead and play it, and there is the Suite breakdown. There is behind the score of The Dark Knight. Thank you guys so much for watching. This episode has been insanely fun to do, just looking at the details and the framework that Hans and James developed, and there's so many cool things to take away from this film and this score, but I just want to look at a few things that Hans and James really focused on that I think truly paid off and really building the whole entire experience. First thing is perspective and character subtext, and this means really diving into the characters' minds and sort of their persona, the way that they see the world, and applying that musically, whether it's the Joker, whether it's Bruce Wayne and his sort of journey through the first film and the second film, which is huge, but it's sort of covered by the music. The next one is fragmentation and musical evolution. Now, Hans and James are introducing all these new elements throughout the film and also building on elements from the first film, but, you know, the Harvey Dent material, all of that, the Joker material, they're introducing it, and then essentially when we get to the last act of the movie, everything sort of comes together and we get this huge sort of crescendo. And so I think that there's a lot to take away from how the music is paced and how the music is spotted to really make the most impact on the film's narrative. The next thing is experimentation. Now with this film, the one thing that's for sure is that they were not fearless of uncharted territory, and that they took the time to really dive into new concepts, whether that's cellos and razor blades, whether that's seamlessly blending orchestral and synthesizer elements so perfectly to where it just creates this one huge sonic framework. And all these different elements sort of combined together. It's new, it's fresh, it's inventive, and that all comes from Hans's and James's ability to sort of make themselves vulnerable and say, we're going to do something different, and sort of being fearless of it. The next thing is collaboration. We can look at Hans's relationship with the sound designer Richard King. We can look at Mel Wesson. We can look at Howard Scarr, Martin Tillman, and essentially there's just so much to get from collaborating with other people and seeing what they can bring to the score. And Hans really knows this, whether it's Man of Steel or Interstellar with Roger Sayer. We've really seen that he knows the importance and the impact of working with other people and really seeing what they can bring and really sort of making them part of the band, so to say. But there's so many things to get from this score, but I've had a great time looking at it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. A lot more to come soon on Behind the Score, but thank you, and I'll see you guys soon.